the hidden liquid that turns dead leaves into rich compost in weeks. Every autumn, something strange happens in backyards all across the world. The trees let go, the wind carries the leaves down, and suddenly the ground disappears under a blanket of gold, copper, and brown. At first, it almost looks beautiful, like nature quietly painting the landscape before winter arrives. But then the leaves keep falling and falling, until your lawn, your garden beds, even the walkways are buried beneath them. So one afternoon, you grab a rake and start pushing them together. Back and forth across the yard, scraping, dragging, piling them up into a towering mound in the corner of the garden. 4 feet high, maybe even higher. And when you finally step back, sweaty and tired, you look at that pile and think you've done something smart. You tell yourself, this isn't waste. This is future soil, free compost, nature doing the work for you. By spring, you think, this will turn into rich black earth. So you leave the pile there and trust the process. Winter arrives. Snow settles on top like a heavy blanket. Cold rain soaks through the layers. Weeks pass, then months. Eventually, you stop thinking about the leaves at all, until one warm morning when spring finally returns. The ground softens, the air smells fresh again, and suddenly you remember that pile waiting in the corner of your yard. You walk over with a shovel, maybe even a little excited, imagining the moment you dig in and uncover dark, crumbly compost ready to feed your garden. But the moment you pull back the top layer, the excitement disappears. Instead of rich soil, you find something completely different. The leaves are still there, flattened into heavy, soggy sheets that peel apart like wet cardboard. They smell sour. The pile feels cold and lifeless. And standing there, staring at that mess, a thought quietly slips into your mind. Maybe composting just isn't for you. Maybe you did something wrong. But what if the truth is something far more surprising? What if the real reason your leaf pile never turns into soil has nothing to do with effort, and everything to do with one missing ingredient that almost nobody ever talks about? Most people are told a very simple idea about composting. Just pile up organic material, walk away, and let nature handle the rest. It sounds logical. After all, leaves fall in the forest every year, and somehow the forest floor always turns into rich soil. So the assumption feels natural. Do the same thing in your backyard, and the same magic should happen. And technically, that belief isn't completely wrong. Nature will eventually break those leaves down. But eventually is the key word. In a forest, decomposition happens slowly, quietly, layer by layer over several seasons. Sometimes it takes 3 years, sometimes even longer. The forest has time on its side, but your garden doesn't. A gardener doesn't need fertile soil 3 winters from now. You need it this season, while your tomatoes, peppers, and greens are actually growing. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because the typical backyard leaf pile isn't behaving like a forest floor at all. In fact, most of the time, it becomes the exact opposite of a compost system. It becomes a preservation system. When leaves are raked into a dense pile and soaked by rain, their structure changes. The layers collapse, pressing tightly together like damp paper. As the weight builds, the air spaces disappear. And without air, the most important workers in compost, the aerobic microbes, can't survive. These microscopic organisms depend on oxygen to break down carbon-rich material like leaves. Take away that oxygen, and their activity slows, then stops entirely. No heat forms inside the pile. No biological engine starts running. Instead of transforming into soil, the leaves simply remain suspended in time, wet, compressed, and lifeless. They don't rot properly. They don't become compost. They just sit there in the corner of the yard, unchanged for months, quietly waiting for something that never arrives. To really understand what's happening inside that stubborn pile of leaves, we need to look a little deeper at what a fallen leaf actually is. When a tree prepares for winter, it does something incredibly efficient. Before letting its leaves drop, it pulls almost all the valuable nutrients back into the trunk and roots. Sugars, minerals, and energy reserves that will help it survive the cold months ahead. What falls to the ground afterward is mostly just the outer structure of the leaf. In biological terms, that structure is made largely of carbon. Carbon is an incredible source of stored energy, but it is also extremely stable. Left on its own, carbon doesn't break down quickly. Think about a stack of firewood sitting beside a cabin. You could leave those logs there for years, and they would still look almost the same. The energy is inside them, but nothing is releasing it. Your pile of autumn leaves is essentially the same thing, a mound of potential energy waiting to be unlocked. The real workers responsible for unlocking that energy are microscopic organisms living in the soil. Billions of bacteria and fungi are ready to move in and start breaking down those leaves. But here's the problem. They can't survive on carbon alone. Just like any living creature, microbes need a balanced diet. Carbon provides energy, but they also need nitrogen to build proteins and reproduce. Without nitrogen, the microbial population can't grow. At first, a few bacteria may begin feeding on the leaves, but very quickly they run out of the nutrients they need to multiply. Their numbers drop, the biological activity fades, and the pile goes cold. This is what gardeners sometimes call a carbon lock. All the energy is there, locked inside the leaves, but the system doesn't have the right ingredients to release it. And until that balance changes, the pile will remain stuck in the same quiet state, looking almost exactly the way it did the day those leaves were first raked together. But once you understand this idea of carbon lock, something important starts to become clear. The problem with your leaf pile was never the leaves themselves. It was the imbalance. Imagine trying to start a campfire using nothing but thick logs. You could stack them perfectly. You could wait for hours. But without the right spark and the right airflow, those logs will never ignite. Compost works in a very similar way. Leaves are the fuel, packed with stored carbon energy, but without nitrogen, the biological fire that breaks them down never truly starts. In healthy compost, there is a delicate balance between carbon-rich materials like dry leaves, straw, or wood chips, and nitrogen-rich materials like fresh plant scraps, manure, or other green organic matter. Scientists often describe this balance using something called the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio. For fast decomposition, that ratio needs to be somewhere close to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. But a pile made entirely of dry autumn leaves can have a ratio closer to 80-1. That means microbes trying to digest the pile are essentially starving. They have plenty of energy in front of them, but none of the nutrients they need to grow and reproduce. Without nitrogen, the microbial population stays small. The pile never heats up, and the transformation into soil slows to a crawl. And this is where many gardeners make their next mistake. Once they hear that compost needs nitrogen, they sprinkle a little fertilizer or a handful of coffee grounds over the top of the pile and assume the problem is solved. But dry powders and small particles rarely mix evenly with a mountain of leaves. Gravity pulls them straight down through the gaps, leaving most of the pile untouched. The nitrogen settles at the bottom while the leaves remain dry and carbon-heavy above. The microbes never get the balanced environment they need, and the pile stays cold. So the real question becomes this: how do you distribute nitrogen evenly through thousands of tiny leaf fragments so every part of the pile can come alive at the same time? The answer begins with something surprisingly simple: a liquid. A liquid may not sound like a dramatic solution, but in the quiet chemistry of compost, it changes everything. Instead of trying to sprinkle nitrogen unevenly across the surface, a liquid allows that nitrogen to travel. It flows through the pile, soaking into the fibers of every leaf, coating the surface where microbes actually live and work. Suddenly, the carbon-rich fuel and the missing nutrient meet at the same place. And when that happens, the entire biological system begins to wake up. Think of it like preparing a dry sponge. When water touches the edges, it slowly spreads inward, filling every tiny pocket of air. A nitrogen-rich liquid works the same way inside a pile of shredded leaves. It doesn't just add moisture, it delivers food directly to the microscopic workforce waiting inside the pile. And that combination of moisture, nitrogen, and carbon is exactly what the microbes need to multiply rapidly. When their population grows, something remarkable begins to happen. Heat appears. Compost piles that are properly balanced don't stay cold. They become warm, sometimes surprisingly hot, because billions of microbes are actively digesting organic matter and releasing energy in the process. This heat is the sign that the system is finally alive. So what exactly goes into this liquid? Fortunately, the recipe doesn't require anything complicated. In many traditional gardens and homesteads, people simply mix fresh animal manure, such as chicken or rabbit manure, with water in a bucket, stirring it until it forms a dark, nutrient-rich solution. That mixture carries both nitrogen and living microbes, creating the perfect biological starter for a compost pile. For gardeners without access to livestock, a similar solution can be made by dissolving high-nitrogen organic fertilizers, like blood meal or pelletized manure, into water. The goal is simple. Create a liquid rich in nitrogen that can move freely through the pile and feed the microbes everywhere, not just in one small spot. But even with the right liquid, one more important step remains before the pile can truly come alive. The leaves themselves need to change form. But before that nitrogen-rich liquid can truly do its job, we need to look more closely at the leaves themselves. At first glance, a fallen leaf may seem fragile and delicate, but in reality, it is surprisingly well engineered. During its life on the tree, a leaf is designed to survive wind, rain, and constant exposure to the elements. Its outer surface is coated with a thin, waxy layer that helps repel water. Its curved shape directs rain toward the tree's roots, acting almost like a tiny roof tile. These features are perfect for helping the tree gather sunlight and manage water. But they create a problem when thousands of whole leaves are stacked together in a compost pile. When rain or liquid fertilizer is poured over a pile of intact leaves, most of that moisture simply slides off the smooth surfaces. Instead of soaking in, it runs down the sides or drains quickly through the gaps. The inside of the pile can remain surprisingly dry while the outside becomes heavy and matted. Microbes cannot easily reach the interior, and the nitrogen solution cannot coat the surfaces where it is needed most. This is why one simple step makes such a dramatic difference in compost speed: shredding the leaves. When leaves are chopped into small fragments, their natural structure is broken open. The waxy coating cracks, the veins are exposed, and the smooth surfaces become rough and absorbent. Suddenly, those pieces behave less like waterproof shingles and more like tiny sponges. Liquid can penetrate them easily, carrying nitrogen and microbes directly into the material. At the same time, shredding increases the total surface area enormously. A single whole leaf has limited space for microbes to attach and feed. But when that leaf is cut into dozens of small pieces, the number of edges and surfaces multiplies. Each fragment becomes an entry point where bacteria and fungi can begin their work. The food is no longer locked inside a tough shell. It becomes accessible, bite-sized, and ready for decomposition. And once those shredded leaves meet the nitrogen-rich liquid in the right environment, the quiet transformation of the pile can finally begin. Once the leaves are shredded and ready to absorb moisture, the next step is choosing the right place to build the pile. This detail may seem small, but it quietly determines whether the compost system will truly come alive or remain slow and stagnant. The ideal place is not on concrete, not on a wooden platform, and not inside a sealed container. The best place is simply a patch of bare earth. When a compost pile sits directly on soil, it stays connected to the underground world beneath it. That soil is already full of life: earthworms, fungi, bacteria, and countless microscopic organisms that spend their days recycling organic matter. As the compost pile begins to warm and soften, these organisms naturally move upward into the material, joining the process and accelerating the breakdown. If the pile dries out or cools down, they can retreat back into the soil and survive until conditions improve. It becomes a living exchange between the pile and the ground below it. Once the location is chosen, the pile itself should be built gradually, layer by layer. Start with a base of shredded leaves spread loosely across the ground, about 6 inches deep. This first layer forms the foundation of carbon-rich fuel. Next, gently pour some of the nitrogen liquid across the surface. The goal is not to flood the pile, but to moisten it evenly. As the liquid spreads through the leaves, mix the material with your hands or a fork so every piece becomes slightly damp. The texture should resemble a wrung-out sponge, moist enough to hold its shape when squeezed, but not dripping with water. After that, add another layer of shredded leaves, and repeat the process again. A little liquid, a little mixing, another balanced layer. Slowly the pile begins to grow taller, forming a mound of evenly moistened material. By the time it reaches about 3 feet in height and width, the compost system has enough mass to hold the heat that the microbes will soon begin to generate. And with the carbon, nitrogen, moisture, and air finally balanced together, the quiet biological engine inside the pile is ready to start running. At this point, something subtle begins to happen inside the pile, even though from the outside it may still look like nothing more than a mound of damp leaves. The microbes that were once struggling to survive now suddenly find themselves in a perfect environment. Carbon is everywhere around them. Nitrogen is available in the moisture coating each fragment, and oxygen is trapped within the small pockets of air between the shredded leaves. With all the ingredients finally balanced, their population begins to multiply rapidly. For the first day or two, this activity is quiet and invisible. But beneath the surface, billions of microscopic organisms are feeding, dividing, and releasing energy. That energy appears as heat. By the third or fourth day, if you gently pull back the cover of the pile early in the morning, you may notice something surprising. Thin wisps of steam rising from the center. If you place your hand into the middle of the pile, the warmth becomes unmistakable. It may feel like reaching into a warm bath or a sun-heated stone. Temperatures inside an active compost pile can climb to around 130 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. This heat is not just a curiosity. It is a powerful signal that the system is alive and working efficiently. At these temperatures, weed seeds and harmful pathogens begin to break down, while the microbes continue consuming the carbon-rich material at remarkable speed. But this intense activity also creates a new challenge. As the microbes burn through oxygen inside the pile, the air pockets gradually shrink. If nothing changes, the system could eventually suffocate and slow down again. That is why turning the pile becomes the next crucial step in keeping the compost engine running. Turning the pile may look like simple physical work, but in reality, it plays a critical role in keeping the entire biological system alive. Inside the center of the compost mound, microbes have been working intensely, consuming oxygen as they break down the leaves. After several days, that central zone becomes hot but starved of fresh air. If the pile is left untouched, the oxygen level continues to drop, and the microbial activity that created all that heat will slowly begin to suffocate. The pile cools, the decomposition slows, and the process drifts back toward the same stagnant state that many gardeners experience with ordinary leaf piles. This is why turning the pile acts almost like opening the windows in a crowded room. When you insert a garden fork and begin lifting the material, the dense layers loosen. The outer sections of the pile, which are cooler and richer in oxygen, are moved toward the center. At the same time, the hot interior material is spread outward where it can breathe again. This simple act redistributes both heat and oxygen throughout the entire mound. As the leaves tumble and separate, new air pockets form, and the microbes immediately begin using that fresh oxygen to restart their work. Sometimes the temperature inside the pile will rise again within a day after turning, showing that the system has been recharged. During this step, it also helps to check the moisture level. The heat generated by microbial activity gradually evaporates water from the pile, so a light sprinkling of water may be needed to keep the material at that familiar, wrung-out sponge texture. Too dry, and the microbes slow down. Too wet, and air cannot circulate properly. By turning the pile every couple of days, you maintain the delicate balance of air, moisture, carbon, and nitrogen that allows the compost to continue transforming. And as this rhythm continues, turning, breathing, warming, the pile begins to change in ways that are both visible and unmistakable. As the turning continues every couple of days, something remarkable begins to unfold inside the pile. At first, the change is subtle. The shredded leaves still look familiar, just darker and softer than before. But around the second week, the transformation becomes impossible to ignore. When you slide your fork into the mound and lift a section into the air, the material no longer behaves like a pile of leaves. It moves differently. The sharp shapes and curled edges that once defined each leaf begin to disappear, blending together into a soft, crumbly texture. The color deepens from pale brown to a rich, dark chocolate tone, and the entire pile starts to look more like soil than plant debris. Even the smell changes. The sour scent of wet leaves fades away and is replaced by something completely different, an earthy, forest-like aroma that feels alive and clean. It is the same scent you notice when you walk through a healthy woodland after rain, when the ground beneath your feet is thick with life. What you are witnessing in that moment is the quiet power of decomposition finally working at full speed. The microbes that once struggled to survive are now thriving in a balanced environment. They are breaking apart complex plant fibers, releasing nutrients, and converting the structure of those leaves into stable organic matter. Every time the pile is turned, the remaining fragments become smaller and more uniform. The material begins to crumble through your fingers like moist cake. And with each passing day, the original leaves become harder to recognize, as if they are slowly dissolving back into the soil from which the tree once drew its life. This is the stage where patience turns into reward, where the pile that once looked like a useless mound of yard waste begins revealing its true identity, something far more valuable than it first appeared. And then, somewhere around the third week, the transformation reaches its quiet conclusion. When you walk over to the pile now, it no longer looks like a pile of leaves at all. The mound has shrunk noticeably, settling lower as the material inside compresses into something denser and richer. When you slide your hand into the compost, the warmth that once filled the center has faded. The pile has cooled, not because the process failed, but because the most intense stage of decomposition has finished its work. The microbes that thrived in the heat have already consumed the easy energy within the leaves. Now the material rests in a new, stable form. Scoop up a handful and let it fall slowly through your fingers. What remains is dark, crumbly, and soft, almost like moist chocolate cake. The original leaves are nearly impossible to recognize. Instead of stiff fragments, you feel fine particles of organic matter that hold moisture without becoming muddy. And the smell. The smell is unmistakable. It's the deep, clean scent of living soil, the same aroma you find on a forest floor where centuries of fallen leaves have quietly returned to the earth. Gardeners often call this finished material black gold, and once you hold it in your hands, the name makes perfect sense. Because this is not just decomposed leaves, it is stored sunlight transformed into fertility. Every leaf that fell from those trees captured energy from the sun during the growing season. Through the slow work of microbes, that energy has now been recycled back into the soil where new plants can use it again. When you spread this compost across your garden beds, you're doing more than adding nutrients. You're rebuilding the living structure of the soil itself. The compost feeds earthworms, supports beneficial microbes, improves water retention, and gives plant roots the environment they need to grow strong and resilient. And perhaps the most satisfying part of all is realizing that something most people see as a seasonal nuisance, those endless piles of autumn leaves, was actually a hidden resource waiting to be unlocked. The trees were never dropping waste. They were quietly delivering the raw ingredients for next year's soil. All you had to do was learn how to release it.